1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. Several days later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile,
5,000 celebrities later.
1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later.
The next morning. Later. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. The next morning. The next morning. Many frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 1 day later. 1 humongous meal later. A little while later. Later that night. 1 entree later. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Several bouquets later. 10 hours later. 80 minutes later. Many memories later. 1 week later. Happy friendiversary.
Later.
Later. Many unbearable moments later. The next morning. Many adorable hours later. Several days later. Much later. 1 week later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later.